This is entitled How a Single Moral Act by Ancient Egyptians Shaped the Purim Story. Obviously, this is about Purim, but it comes from a very unlikely place. It comes from the Midrash Rabbah at the very end of the book of Bereshis in Vayechi, when Yaakov has just passed away and they are now taking him to Marat HaMachpelah. So the Midrash makes a very unfathomable statement. I'm going to read it to you. Amar Rav Abu said, Osan Shivim Yomim Shabin Egeret Li Geret. In the Purim story, there were 70 days between the edict that Haman sent out, basically saying there's a free-for-all in the entire Persian Empire, a free-for-all on killing Jews. 70 days later, by that time, Haman was killed, and now Mordechai was elevated, and he could send out another edict, which in effect canceled out the first edict, declaring that the Jews can defend themselves. So it undid all the damage of the first edict. That was a 70-day period. So the Midrash says those 70 days are keneged, right, as opposed to, or somehow compared to, Shivim Yom Shoshu Mitzrayim Chesed Avinu Yaakov, the 70 days in which the Egyptians did a chesed, an act of kindness to Yaakov by mourning him for 70 days. In other words, there were 40 days when he was embalmed, and then 30 more days of mourning. It was a total of 70 days. So the Midrash is making a comparison between this 70-day period, which happened in the Purim story from the time that the edict started until it was annulled, to the 70 days in which the Egyptians were mourning our forefather Jacob. So let's analyze the 7-day period in the Purim story. It seems that the Jewish people committed such a grave sin in enjoying the banquet of King Ahasuerus that they were, God forbid, scheduled to be annihilated. And they needed a severe and intense kind of repentance, a repentance that felt like, according to the commentaries, as if they were giving up their life, sanctifying their life for God's name. And so they repented for 70 days because each day is considered a year, and it's known that 70 years is a complete lifetime. So it's as if they're giving a complete lifetime of repentance to try to wipe away the terrible sin that they did. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the Egyptians who were honoring and showing gratitude to our father Jacob, that's obviously because when Jacob came to Mitzrayim, he right away ended the 7 bad years of famine. And so they felt that they owed their life to Jacob. And so they had this kind of intense mourning. And interestingly enough, they also felt that they owed him sort of a lifetime of gratitude. So they also had the mourning go on for 70 days, again, with the calculation of 1 day per year. And it's like 70 years, a complete life, a lifetime of gratitude versus a lifetime of repentance for the Jews in Persia. So everything I've said up to now came from commentaries whose source is a book from the 18th century called Yarot Devash. And there, the author laments that in his time, the Jews were not living up even to the moral standards of certain righteous Gentiles. And they were doing things he lists as, white-collar crime or not sufficiently honoring your father and mother, these kind of things that people just do instinctually as knowing it's the right thing, that certain Jews were lacking in this area. And he said, because we are not living up to the standards of certain non-Jews, even though this is mandated in our Torah, it's causing a prolonged exile. And so this is beginning to reflect on something going on that we're going to develop more when we look into the Talmud. So the commentary of Torah actually comes out and says that this outpouring of gratitude that the Egyptians had in some way is a symptom of something that was lacking in the Jewish people and came out in the story of Purim and this near calamity. His source is a Talmud Sanhedrin, which tells a very bizarre story about the king of Moab, who it seems was checking on exactly what merit the Jewish people have. And he was told, they have this a forefather in their religion called Abraham, and he almost sacrificed his son Isaac. And that self-sacrifice gave tremendous merit to the Jewish people. So the king said, I'll outdo Abraham. I will take my oldest son, who was designated to take my place, and I will sacrifice him. And he did. And somehow, because the Jews at the time were worshiping idols, and this idol worshiper did this, and there's a difference of opinion in the Talmud whether he did it actually in the name of God, the Jewish God, or in the name of his idols, but either way, it was, so to speak, an embarrassment to the Jewish people because he was giving up so much to show his love of God and his devotion to God, and yet the Jewish people themselves were worshiping idols. And so now you're developing this principle where the Jewish people can be outshined by non-Jews as far as their moral conduct. And in fact, the Talmud concludes on that page to say that the Jews have an obligation to look at non-Jews, and if they can't get these messages from our own Torah, which everything is, of course, there, so they could look at certain righteous Gentiles and say, I would like to model my behavior after them. I should do that. And for this we are rewarded, but we would be punished if we only looked at the worst behavior of the nations of the world and adopted those. So in conclusion, we were trying to figure out that mysterious word keneged, that the act of the Egyptians was somehow related to what happened to the Jews in the Purim story. And our first take was, they both were drawing upon these 70 years, a lifetime of gratitude or a lifetime of repentance. But now we see another idea emerging, that perhaps what the Midrash meant was this intense gratitude showed by the Egyptians was actually showing a flaw in the Jewish people that emerged at times, a flaw in gratitude. And of course, what do I mean by that? They went to this banquet of the king, and they were showing allegiance and giving kingship to the king Achashverosh, when they were on the cusp of building the second temple and showing their allegiance and the ultimate reign of God and the temple of Jerusalem. So there was a problem with their gratitude, and perhaps that's what the Midrash meant when it said this is keneged that. This is opposed to that, saying that this of gratitude that was shown so beautifully by the Egyptians again underscores a flaw which burst on the scene in the story of Purim and needed to be remedied. Have a great Purim.